All right, so we are looking at basic exercise science today. We are going to start breaking down the kinetic chain. We cannot understand how the body moves without understanding some of our gross anatomy or just overall anatomy. Although, you know, zoom in enough and it is gross. So we are going to be looking mostly at the skeletal system, which is our framework for everything, and our nervous system, which is going to sort of manipulate everything, right? So purpose of today's lesson, we want to give you guys a pretty good understanding of the overall kinetic chain. Now, I'm not doing the entire kinetic chain today. We're really only doing 2/3 of it. We're going to look, like I said, at the overall like structure portion, which is the skeletal system, and then we're going to look at sort of the command center with the nervous system there. Once we understand that, tomorrow we'll be able to much better understand muscles, which is sort of in the middle. You know, like your muscular system is what manipulates your skeletal system, but it's under the control of your nervous system. So we're going to look at how all of these things are very, very, very connected. So today, our objective is to have you guys feel pretty confident about understanding the nervous and skeletal systems and how those systems sort of adapt and respond to stress and stuff. So when I am talking about the human movement system, right? You know, one of the, like, if we look at the levels of organization inside the body, right? We kind of break it down like this. You have like, you know, chemicals, right? Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, you know, all those little things. And then they come together, and a bunch of chemicals all come together to make up like a cell. And then a bunch of cells come together to make up like tissues, and a bunch of tissues to make up an overall organ. And then like a lot of organs work together to make up like systems. So by definition, each one of your individual bones is actually its own individual organ in a lot of ways. Each one of your muscles is technically its own individual organ. You know, I know that like first time I heard that, I was like, when I think of organ, I think of like my heart or my lungs. And I was like, well, that's your cardiorespiratory system. You know, a system is made up of several organs coming together. And then an organism, you know, you and me, is made up of just like a bunch of systems all sort of like functioning. So the main one that we talk about is the human movement system, which we much more commonly refer to as the kinetic chain, right? We like the term kinetic chain because it is the human movement system, and it kind of paints a picture even in the name. You know, it is 3 interdependent systems. You know, they're not independent, they all very much rely on one another, you know, in order to create and manipulate human movement, right? So you ever hear that phrase, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link? Well, that's very true of the kinetic chain. That's actually why we like to use that term so much, because it kind of paints this picture, right? If my nervous system can't control my muscular system properly, because maybe I just learned how to do something the wrong way, right? Well, now my muscular system is going to get manipulated the wrong way. And maybe I'm going to pull a muscle because it wasn't really designed to do that much work. You know, I'm using the wrong muscle to get a certain job done, right? Or maybe your muscular system has pulled a muscle in the past, and so now it's got like scar tissue, and so it doesn't move quite as effectively. It's a little stiff compared to how it's supposed to be. It's not quite as mobile, or it's tight, right? And then that's going to move your skeletal system around the wrong way, and bones are going to kind of grind on one another, and it can cause aches and pains or impingements, you know, and that's not great. Or maybe your skeletal system has experienced like a ligament tear of some type, and now it has decreased stability, which your muscular system is trying to stabilize and trying to control, but your nervous system doesn't really know how to do it, right? So you can see how every one of these systems, if any of them are out of whack, all of them are out of whack, right? So your nervous system is responsible for creating the communication network throughout the body. Its job is really to kind of communicate with the other systems and, you know, act as the command center. The muscular system is designed to sort of create the internal tension that actually moves us around. You know, each one of those individual muscular organs is able to shorten, and then it's able to relax. Your muscles can't necessarily push. We'll get into that tomorrow, but it can pull, and then it can relax back to its original length. And so it can pull and it can relax back to its original length. So if you were to do that while attaching it to 2 separate bones, you know, if we look at if you were to sort of look at like how your, let's see if I can get an actual GIF that moves this darn thing around. There we go. You know, this muscle here, your bicep, if it pulls towards its center, you know, like this, that's going to sort of move that bone around, right? You can see it can cause like pronation and supination there. And then it can kind of bend the elbow. That's the more common. You can even see it kind of bunching up a little bit, right? And that's really that muscle's main job, right? It kind of lives there. And when it shortens, it creates this, this movement, right? So there you can see its antagonist. Actually, there's the triceps on the other side. When the arm extends, that muscle contracts and it pulls it back to straight, you know. So that's sort of what's manipulating us around, right? That's what's causing us to move. And so, you know, it is all under the control of our nervous system, but these muscular organs are very cool because they create their own internal tension. And that's actually what drags the skeletal system, which is your framework, around. So that's there to protect delicate structures and allow your muscular system to have something to manipulate, you know? So let's go ahead and start by talking about the nervous system. This is one of the main organ systems inside your body. It is made up of very specialized cells called neurons, which we're going to look at here in just a minute. And those neurons are particularly good at running, not only like running electricity through their body, but also generating their own internal electricity, which is really cool. Your nervous system basically runs on a series of electrochemical signals. So if we look at like a neuron anatomy here, you can actually see, you know, your nervous system's job is to provide a communication network throughout your body. And that's kind of a weird thing to say, because you're like, when you think communication network, I don't know about you, but I think telephone poles, you know, like I'm thinking like the internet is a communication network, you know. It's like, you know, my thing's not working. And so I hop online and I open up a chat bubble and I'm like, hey, tech support, I need some help here, right? Like that's a network to me, you know. But in your body, your nervous system is this network. And when you look at it, you can actually see it kind of makes sense, even based on just like the structure here. I mean, look at this picture here. Look at all these individual neurons, or look at this one. You know, they're all connected to one another. So, you know, it's like your neurons are playing this game of telephone, right? This guy told this guy to do something and told this one to do something and told that one to do something and that one and that one. And eventually that's what traveled all the way from my brain down to my bicep to make me go like that. So one of the main systems inside of your body containing these very specialized cells. Now, we do in general like to divide our nervous system into two primary divisions. Okay, you are going to have your central nervous system. That's your CNS, right? Your central nervous system, if you look at this, is going to be this section. Actually, that's not. Give me some more distinct colors, internet. There we go. I like this one. So you can actually see here's our central nervous system. It really is the, you know, if your nervous system is already the command center, this is like the command center of the command center. You know, like this is like the CEO of everything, right? And it's your brain as well as your spinal cord. That's your central nervous system. It's pretty easy to remember considering, you know, central, it's dead center, you know. And so the central nervous system is really responsible for all the decision making. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense when we think about our brains. You know, our brains is, you know, we give it all the credit for decision making. You know, even though we do, you know, sometimes talk about like gut feelings, right? But we talk about how our brain is responsible for all of our decision making. It's actually not always true. Sometimes when you have a really intense stimulus, for instance, like getting smacked on the kneecap with like that little hammer that your doctor's got, you know, or, you know, stubbing your toe even, or touching a really hot stove, your central nervous system can actually make what's called a spinal reflex. So what'll happen is, let's say you step on a nail, right? That signal is going to travel up and it gets to the spine. Normally it would travel up the spine. Your brain would go, What was that? Oh, stepped on a nail. That's not good. Let's move the foot away, right? And it would make all this decision. It would travel then back down and then, go to the muscles that move your leg. You go, but in a situation like this, it's actually so intense that it gets to the spine, and your spine will actually make that decision on the way back for you. And then your brain figures out about it later, which is kind of cool. But because it's not your brain, these responses are usually very simple, which is why any of you guys who have ever been startled by someone, maybe jumping out behind a door, or you touch something you didn't expect to touch, and generally it tends to be a pretty simple response. You go like this, right? And then if you got somebody standing next to you, what happened to them? They got hit in the face. Like if your brain had been in charge, you would have been like, oh, and then I'll watch out for Bob, but there was no time for Bob in a spinal reflex. And so those are kind of cool responses, and we'll look back at those. Those are actually going to be very important in this module, because that is actually something that athletes very much rely on. You guys ever been, I don't know why this is the example, but this has happened to me many times. You ever been like chewing something, or like gum, for instance, and maybe you're talking a little bit too fast, and I've had this happen a few times in my life, and it'll pop out of your mouth, like just be boop, and it just goes flying. And somehow, like a freaking superhero, you just go and catch it right out of the air without even looking at it. Pretty cool, right? That is very much a good example of something that is kind of where like instinct and quickness kind of takes over. That's the kind of reflexes we want to adapt in our athletes. So we're actually going to spend a lot of time talking about spinal reflexes, this module in particular, because they make us much more explosive and much more quick, I guess is the right term for it. Now, here's the thing. All of this has to control of your muscles, which are not exactly close to the brain. You think about like how far away your calf muscles are. They're not close, right? So we have to have all kinds of other nerves that are connecting from the brain down to these more peripheral parts of our body. And that's where our PNS comes from. That's your peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is comprised of all the peripheral nerves that are running throughout your body. So information has to get to the brain, and information has to get from the brain. If I grab like a dumbbell with my right hand, information is going to come into my brain and say, hey, this weighs about 10 pounds. We're trying to bend the elbow. We need about 10 pounds of work. So then information comes from my brain back over to the bicep, and it recruits about 10 pounds worth of strength, right? So that's the peripheral nervous system, right? Information goes in, hits the spine, travels up to the brain, right? The brain travels it back, and it goes back through the peripheral nervous system again, right? So if we sort of look at a different picture here, you can kind of see that. No, now I want them together. You can see, right? So like, you touch a sharp thumbtack, the information goes into through the peripheral system up to the spine. If it's not that sharp, maybe it goes up to the brain. And then it comes back down, and we execute the appropriate response. So the peripheral system is the connection point. Again, the CEO is making all the decisions, but he's got to get information from all of his workers before he can make any decisions, right? Information has to come in order for him to know what the appropriate response is. Then he also has to tell someone to execute that response. And that's where the peripheral system comes in. So there is sort of two directions within the peripheral system there. So those are our two primary divisions. So what we've been talking about are sort of the functions of our nervous system, right? It's going to be three primary functions that we're talking about here, right? Obviously, there is going to be sensory function. Sensory function is your nervous system's ability to sense changes in not only the external environment, but also the internal environment. There's actually a lot of this stuff happening that I'm describing right now without you even realizing it. So for instance, any of you who have already had breakfast today, I don't know if I've got any intermittent fasters out there, but if you've had breakfast today, it's sitting in your gut right now. So how does your gut know how to move something from your stomach where it's dissolving all that food? And once it's all dissolved, it's this, wet, goopy paste, right? And move it into your small intestine so that it can actually get into your bloodstream. How does your brain, how does your stomach know when to open up? Because if it were just to like open up, you'd have like a chunk of like full apple just rolling in, clogging up that tube. That would be bad. So how does your brain know how to control that? Well, again, it has what's called sensory function. So there's little stretch receptors at the very bottom of your stomach. Actually, if you look at it, I can Google one of those. Stretch receptors, stomach. News. Wait, where is my images button? What? Who moved Google? Okay. So if you look at your stomach here, actually I don't need the caloric density picture. Just there we go. Right about here at the very bottom portion, right here, there's going to be some little sensory receptors. And that's actually part of your nervous system. So these stretch receptors right here are going to send a signal to the brain. And if it's like really chunky, if the sensory information coming in is like, oh yeah, no, that's like a solid piece of food, then the information from the central nervous system is going to send it back down and say, okay, well then keep the stomach contracted. And that's going to keep the food in the stomach acid to give it longer to dissolve. So sensory information goes towards the brain, so your brain knows what to do. And then motor information comes back in the opposite direction, right? This is the neuromuscular response to motor information. So again, I grab a 10-pound dumbbell, sensory information goes into my brain then interprets it, we'll look at that in a second, and then motor information comes from my brain to move it with the appropriate amount of strength. That way you don't go ripping door off the hinges when you go to open it. You're going to get like a coffee mug and you're just like, like we don't want to do that, right? You only need a little bit of strength to open that cabinet door, right? How do you know how much strength to use? Well, that's sensory information coming in, right? And then motor information going out is the appropriate neuromuscular response. Now, I kind of just touched on, how do you know how much strength to use? Well, that's the integrative information, right? So the integrative information, in my opinion, is the coolest. It's the ability of your nervous system to analyze and interpret the sensory information. This allows for proper decision making, right? Again, if I go to pick up if I grab a 5-pound dumbbell and I use my entire biceps worth of strength, I'm going to curl that dumbbell like this. I'm gonna be like, whoosh, like you see it in like cartoons where people get like superpowers, for like they get like super strength for the first time and they go to lift something and then they rip the door off the hinges, or like they accidentally slam things. I remember my favorite version of that is the first Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man. There's a great scene in that where he goes to like turn the water on and he like completely rips the faucet in half. And then like he breaks it and like there's just water spewing everywhere. And he's like, what's going on? Because he has super strength. His brain has no idea how to control all that super strength. It's running on the old software information of like a normal human body, right? So his integrative information, he doesn't have enough info to know how to operate things, which is one of the reasons why we need to train our nervous systems so specifically. Particularly for those of you who are new, we're going to spend a lot of time teaching you guys how to do wobbly, unstable versions of exercises that you're already probably somewhat familiar with. I love a chest press. I think it's great. Dumbbells on a bench, it's a great exercise. But I also really love like a stability ball chest press, because when you're on that ball and you're wobbling around a little bit while you're trying to do that chest press movement, you're getting all kinds of information. I'm getting information from here. I'm getting information from here, from here, from here, from here, from here, while I'm doing it. And so new information comes into my brain and I'm teaching my brain new skills, right? It's like learning a new alphabet. right? I'm like, oh, that letter makes this sound, that letter makes this sound, and I'm learning how to read. That is where integrative information comes in. So that is the ability of your nervous system to interpret stuff. So again, kind of going through this whole process, right? Imagine, we've got our sections of the nervous system here. Somebody touches like a hot stove. So sensory information comes in. Integrative information goes, holy crap, that's hot. The appropriate response is to move the arm away. And then motor information goes back and moves the arm away. And that's basically how our nervous system works. So our job is basically going to be to give our clients as much sensory information as possible so that their brain learns as much as possible and knows how to create a lot of different motor responses. Does that make sense, guys? Do these sections of anatomy? Does these sections of anatomy?
Yeah.
Can I get an order over here, by the way? Love it. Yeah. Anybody? Any questions?
Sorry,
So
I just had a quick question. Are all these notes in the Canvas?
They sure are. So yes, I normally talk about this at the end, but I'll address this right now, actually.
Okay.
So Alexis, there will be an email later tonight at about 5 o'clock. It will have the notes attached, as well as a link to the notes on Google Drive, just in case the attachment doesn't work. There will also be a link to the YouTube video that we're recording right now that is going to go on YouTube. And then in the description of that YouTube is the link to the Google Drive notes. It will also be on Canvas. And then Canvas will also have the YouTube video. So there are 4 places to get these notes on the internet.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And if you were to go to Canvas right now, you could get them today. The email goes out about 5:30. But if you wanted to go to Canvas, like literally right now, you would just click day 1. Oh, not that button.
Also, does the Canvas app, is that connected to Sochi? Because I tried to download the app and it wasn't taking the school name.
Yes. So here's the thing. The app does not work particularly well.
Okay.
My recommendation is to just bookmark the website because the app is one of those crappy apps that just takes you to the website anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
So like, it's not even a program. It's not a program. It's literally just like, it just slingshots you to the website. So what I always tell people to do, just bookmark the website and use that as the app. And if you want an app button for it, then just make that bookmark that site and just put that on your phone or whatever. That's what I do. But yeah, we've been working with Canvas for like 2 years now, and I still don't know how to get that app to work.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that thing's a nightmare. Okay. So let's talk about my favorite section. We're going to talk about proprioception here. So proprioception is taking this concept that we just talked about a little bit further. So by definition, proprioception, there's a couple different definitions in your book, by the way, which does drive me a little crazy. But it's the ability, your body's ability to sense the relative position of adjacent body parts. So a good example of what I mean by proprioception is like if I take my hand behind my head, I can't see what my hand is doing. But if I wiggle my fingers, right, I know I'm wiggling my fingers. Now, that might sound really obvious to somebody who's not studying anatomy. It's like, well, yeah, of course, you're wiggling your fingers. You're the one telling your fingers to wiggle. It's like, okay, great. Yeah, that's actually a pretty decent argument. But, how many times have you told somebody to do something and it didn't happen? I imagine many times. I imagine the dishes are a very good example,
Yeah.
Right? Like I can think of a million times where I've tried to do something and it didn't happen the way I sort of thought about it, right? So proprioception is a good example of like the information's going to and the information's coming back. How do I know my fingers are wiggling? I can feel it. right? I can feel the stretch receptors in this finger and this finger and this finger actually moving around specifically, right? And so if this finger is stretched, that's going to feel different than this finger, which is straight, right? And that information comes into my brain. And so if I were, my favorite way to sort of describe proprioception, this is a weird analogy, but I call it the duck analogy. If I gave you a box that you can't see through, and I said there's an animal in that box, right? You have no idea what animal it's going to be, except for the fact that it's smaller than, whatever size box is. You're like, okay, it's probably not an elephant, but you're going to run the information that you have past all the information stored in your brain. So then if I start giving you clues and I start giving you more information, the picture in your brain is going to become clearer and clearer. If I was like, this is a creature with feathers, and you're going to, oh, okay, so that's probably going to mean a bird. It eliminates pretty much anything, that's not a reptile of some type. Unless it's a dinosaur. They're putting feathers in the new Jurassic Park movie, which I'm stoked about. Focusing. And I was like, and it's got webbed feet. And you're gonna, oh, okay, so it could be maybe a penguin, or maybe there's like you're gonna go through all the webbed feet, feathered creatures you know of. And then I was like, and it quacks. And you're like, oh, okay, well that means it's not a goose, because goose is honk, right? I don't know. Right? So you're going to run all the information that you have. Well, if you get information from your finger that says, hey, this bone is experiencing this much pressure in between these two segments of bone, and then this muscle is experiencing this much tension, and then this muscle is at this length, right? Your brain interprets all that information. Then it goes, oh, it must be in this position. And that's how your brain understands where it is in space. Now here's what, and that's amazing, right? That's what proprioception is. That's how your brain understands what position it's in. If I close my eyes and I bend this arm to halfway, right? I could go further, I could go straighter, right? If I'm halfway in between, right? The way I know that I'm in this position is because my bicep is sending a signal to my brain saying, I'm at about 50% max length. I could go this much further, I could go this much shorter. And my brain gets that information and says, great. That means I know that we're bent about halfway. And that's what proprioception really is. It's all the information coming to your brain to give you spatial awareness, right? It is your body's understanding of what position it's in. And this is a really, really important concept for us because your body likes to lie. Unfortunately, the information coming into your brain is sometimes not accurate information. So for instance, if you have scar tissue in that bicep muscle, the muscle might say to the brain, hey, I'm at full length and I can't stretch any further, which is not true, but it is the information coming into my brain. So if that is not true, what'll end up happening is my brain will go, oh, well, if I can't stretch any further, I'll go ahead and stop lengthening the muscle. I'll go ahead and let that muscle stay in that contracted position because obviously it can't stretch any further. The muscles wouldn't lie to me, right? So then all of a sudden, this becomes as far as I can straighten my arm. When in reality, I should be able to straighten it all the way to here. But again, that scar tissue is sending a signal saying, no, we can't stretch any further. We're at maximum length right now. When in reality, this is maximum length. So we start to end up with alterations in our posture. And our body starts to find new ways to move. So if we all know that person who, might have a little bit of like shoulder elevation. Maybe they have a job in life where they're working on the computer all day, right? And they just get used to being in this position. And now this becomes the information coming to the brain saying, yeah, no, we're fully stretched out. When in reality, it should be this. So now their body has to find new ways to move around. This is where tight muscles come from, our bad habits. We had a great conversation last night. I'm trying to remember who, yesterday we were talking about like where I think it was the morning session. Cyrus, I think it was your crew. And Marja, I think maybe we were talking about, I'm trying to remember what section I was talking about this in, but we were talking about modern shoes and how I kind of hate modern shoes. as like a kinesiologist. Was that the morning?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're kind of talking about like how I'm not a big fan of the modern shoe, because if we look at like modern shoes, they look like this. And it's gotten better in the last few years as we've sort of like realized things, but a lot of modern shoes, they kind of look like where there's like, this is like an over-engineered shoe. Look at how much padding there is in the back compared to the front. It kind of puts all of us, and like dress shoes, I really don't like dress shoes either. It's this big hard heel that comes down to a really thin flat sole. And what that does is that puts us into what is called plantar flexion. And plantar flexion is where you are basically, it's when you're pointing your toe away. Okay, so we got dorsiflexion, which is pulling your toe back. Plantar flexion is pointing your toe forward. And so we kind of end up in plantar flexion all freaking day, nonstop, you know, while we're wearing shoes, maybe 18 hours. Look at all these. Look at Yeezys are egregious. And so like, it really does kind of like, and like the air bubble thing, God. So what that does is that means that our body gets used to, goes, oh, this must be our neutral position, right? A pointed toe is our neutral position. When in reality, that means one of your muscles is contracting all day, and one of your other muscles is relaxing all day. So we start to end up with tight calf muscles because our brain starts to think, oh, this is neutral, and it's not. So we have altered our proprioception. And that's my go-to example for right now, just because, you know, we kind of talked about it yesterday. It's not like I'm going to have everybody go out and burn their shoes, you know. If it's, you know, if you have no problems or dysfunctions, then you're fine, you know. You know, I've got shoes that look like that I use occasionally, you know. So that's kind of how we're altering our information. You know, we've goofed up the information coming into our nervous system. You sit all day, well, then your body starts to think that, you know, this is a neutral position. And so then when you try to straighten out this muscle, that muscle tries not to stretch. So then you end up like, you know, shortening it, and you end up with an anterior pelvic tilt, or what we like to call lower cross syndrome. So that is sort of what we, you know, and that's the real big stuff. We've got some smaller anatomy that I'm going to go through right here that is not quite as relevant for this course. Really what we just got done talking about, that's really the idea of being able to assess our clients. You know, if I see a client with really tight calves, I'm going to say, oh, you have excessive plantar flexion. You need more dorsiflexion in your life. So I'm going to work on strengthening those dorsiflexors. I'm going to work on stretching those plantar flexors. And that's how I'm going to sort of get my client's posture back to neutral. So any questions on that before we're going to move into a different section here. But everybody feeling pretty good so far?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yep.
Love that. All right, well, let's look at neurons, right? So zooming in, like I said, this is some like microanatomy. It's important, but more important in later mods. So I'm going to move through it a little bit quicker. But looking at some of this functional anatomy here, like I said, we got the neuron, right? The neuron is what makes up your nervous system. Billions upon billions of little tiny neurons. And there's going to be three main categories of neurons here, right? You're going to have sensory neurons. They're responsible for the sensory function we talked about earlier, right? So sensory neurons are the neurons that are traveling towards the brain, right? Their job is to sense something over there, get the information over to the brain, right? So we call that, oh, and by the way, I want to apologize on behalf of science teachers everywhere. This term is going to suck. These are what are known as afferent neurons, okay? Afferent neurons are going towards the brain. Sensory neurons, right? A muscle senses that it's being lengthened and it sends that information to the brain. That's an afferent neuron that's doing that. On the flip side, information that's coming from the brain going towards a muscle, those are called, here it is, efferent neurons. That sucks. And I'm sorry. I will try to enunciate as best I can because that does get confusing very quickly. Afferent versus efferent. But you can just think of them as sensory neurons and motor neurons. Motor neurons are going from the brain to a site that creates a motor movement, right? So from the brain to an effector site, that might be a muscle or it might be an organ, you know? I can kind of hack your nervous system here, hopefully, for just a second. Everybody think of delicious, amazing, salty pizza. See it in your mind's eye, you know, awesome and greasy and wonderful pizza. Chances are you probably started salivating a little bit just now. Afferent information came in, your brain interpreted it, thought that it was getting pizza, and efferent information went back and made your salivary glands start, you know, making some spit. That is sort of how that works, right? So motor information is going back, right? So for instance, if your muscle senses that it's being lengthened with a sensory neuron, then the motor neurons in that muscle might cause it to contract in order to prevent it from being over lengthened, you know, and that's called a stretch reflex. So when you stretch a muscle and it contracts back in response, you know, the sensory neurons kind of freaked out because they're like, whoa, we got stretched really quickly. And so then they contracted in response by recruiting the motor neurons. So, and then there are interneurons. Interneurons are basically connecting from place to place to place to place. Obviously, we can't just have one wire running from our brain down to our quadricep. That would be, you know, very easy to disconnect. So we've got one neuron from the brain going to another neuron, to another one, to another one, to another one. And then a billion another ones later, we get to the actual quadricep. Maybe not a full billion, but those are your interneurons, and they connect from neuron to neuron. So looking at the divisions of our nervous system, as we understand this, we've got our brain and our spinal cord. Like I said, that is the central system. Now, the central system is, you know, like I said, it's the command center. It's responsible for all the decision making. And then your peripheral nervous system branches out from there. Okay, so your peripheral nervous system are all the peripheral nerves that sort of branch away from the central system, and they're providing that connection point, that communication network with the central system. So we're going to go ahead and divide that peripheral system into two sections. There's the stuff that you can control, and there's the stuff that you can't control. So like your heart rate right now is being controlled by your nervous system, but you don't have any control over it. And I know you might be, it's like, well, I could breathe calmly and think happy thoughts, and that slows my heart rate down. So yes, I do have control over my heart rate. No, you don't. Because you can't go beat, right? Like I can't make my heart beat. It just happens naturally in response. It is controlled by my nervous system, but if you had to like think about controlling your heart rate all day, I don't know about you guys, but I tend to be a pretty distractible person. And I would 100% forget to beat my heart sometimes. And then that would be the end of me, you know? So we have two divisions of our peripheral section, right? We have the somatic section that is responsible for voluntary conscious movements, right? So when I, you know, blink my eyes on purpose, that's my somatic nervous system. When I bend my elbow, that's my somatic nervous system, right? It's peripheral because it's not attached directly to my brain, but it is still somatic, right? I have control over it. Autonomic is the involuntary stuff. Thinking of pizza and then all of a sudden you're spitty, you know, that's involuntary. You don't really have control over that. Your heart rate is involuntary. Your blood vessels dilating and constricting, right? That's involuntary. Your stomach, you know, moving that food into out of the stomach into your small intestine, it's involuntary. Thank goodness we don't have to think about that stuff, right? Now, that might seem like it's unimportant to us as trainers, but we do actually train our autonomic nervous system. We actually do. You know, by exposure to stress, you are actually teaching your body that you are good at dealing with stress. And so you actually get better at training the autonomic nervous system. It's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to warm up and important for us to cool down, because it signals to our body, hey, we are going into a stressful situation, which is called working out. And your body goes, okay, great. And so then it learns to dilate all the blood vessels to your muscle and constrict the blood vessels going to like the things that are not important right now, like your digestive system. It's important in general, but not to working out. And then once the workout is over and we cool down, our nervous system goes, all right, we survived. We fought off the bear, you know? And so then it says the stress is over. Let's go ahead and calm down. And so then the blood vessels to your skeletal muscle constrict, and the blood vessels to your recovery system dilate. So you are very much training your autonomic nervous system, even if you don't have voluntary control over it. We just, the heart rate example that I used is actually a good example of that. You want to learn how to calm down and be a more relaxed person? Practice meditation. It's a very good way for you to train your autonomic nervous system, because you can change other things in your life even if you don't have voluntary conscious control over this other thing. I can't control the stress that's going to happen to me, but I can control my response to it. There's my Deepak Chopra part of the lesson today, the metaphysical part of it. So then we've also got the autonomic part of our nervous system dividing into two other divisions, which is related to what we just talked about, either stress or sort of unstress, So the autonomic nervous system is going to divide down one more time into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. The sympathetic system is the fight or flight response. That's the stress, right? You're stuck in traffic. Sympathetic nervous system gets a little active, you start producing adrenaline, you get all angry, right? That's the sympathetic fight or flight response. And then the parasympathetic is often called the rest and digest response. It's like, it's okay, we survived, life is good, and like I said, that is how we sort of train those things. This is one of the reasons why it is so important, guys. When you do something awesome, take a second to recognize your own awesomeness, just take a second to be like, hey, good job, me. Oh, thanks, other me. The more you can do that, the more you're actually training that sympathetic part of your nervous system. And you're getting better at, recognizing, when you successfully do stuff. And it's like training a dog, like you went to the bathroom outside, you get a treat, right? Oh, I did my homework on time. Good job, me. I get a mental treat, It is actually a good way to kind of hack your habits, which is something we do talk about later on. Those of you who have been through a couple mods know that, in our exercise psychology class, we call that classical conditioning. We use it. It's a very effective tool, It's one of the reasons why I love workout journals so much. When I'm using my workout journal, not only is it a good way for me to track when my weights are going up in the gym, it's also a good way for me to just track when I'm making progress and feel good about myself. Whenever I hit a new PR, I put a little box around it, put a little star, put a little exclamation point, write myself a note, be like, hey, good job, Brad. Like those little things make you feel good. And they're a great way to kind of hack your habits. So those are the divisions of our nervous system. Now, probably the coolest thing we're going to look at today, in my not always so humble opinion, are our sensory receptors, okay? So sensory receptors are part of your nervous system, but they don't live in your nervous system. They actually live in other places. So we actually saw a sensory receptor earlier when we looked at the stomach. You've got sensory receptors in the stomach that are, let me look up stretch receptors instead. Right there at the end. Well, those are, where'd the picture I pulled up earlier? There it is. There's a little less pixelated one. So you get little sensory receptors, stretch receptors in this case, in the stomach that say, hey, I'm being stretched, therefore the food is a little bit too chunky. Let's go ahead and leave that food in here a little bit longer. And then once that stretch receptor is like, oh, okay, that's like goopy paste, great. we're good to absorb that, right? Then it'll open up. So again, these stretch receptors in this case sort of send the information to the brain so my brain knows what to do. There's also like chemoreceptors in your stomach. If your food is too acidic, or if there's like a bacteria or a virus that happens to come into your stomach, chemoreceptors will actually sense that and go, uh-oh, that is going to make us sick. So then it actually triggers other receptors, motor response, which is to go, all right, everybody out, you know, like, and then it comes this way, which is not so great. But that's happening all over your body. That is actually part of your nervous system. So there's a lot of different sensory receptors out there. These are specialized receptors that transform stimuli into information for our brain to interpret. So there are what are called nociceptors, right? I can give you an example of a nociceptor. If I grab my skin here and I start pinching, you know, it's not really that bad. But if I start really pinching, more and more of these nociceptors start to turn on. They're kind of like a floodgate, right? Like 1 or 2, not so bad, 3 or 4, a little bit worse, 5 or 6, oh, it starts to hurt, you know? And they're what are known as pain receptors. You might have a little bit more sensitive pain receptors in certain places compared to others. Ladies in the call, you have less sensitive pain receptors than the guys in the call do, which is why statistically women are a little bit better at dealing with pain than men are. Sorry, guys, it's just the reality. But that is sort of like part of things, you know?
It's because of main receptor?
Pain receptors, yeah, they're a little less sensitive. Yeah. The more sensitive a pain receptor is, the more likely it is to kind of freak out, you know? And that's why some, you know, like me, my pain receptors, I build up an idea in my head whenever I get near a needle. I am not good at dealing with needles. So, you know, my sensory receptors, when I get into a situation, I turn them on before that thing even touches me. I'm like, ah, and they're like, we haven't even put it in yet. I'm like, I know. But like, you know, again, like you think about like the pain during something like childbirth, right? It is something that like biologically, I am not designed to deal with. You know, guys really are. And we're just a little bit, you know, more sensitive in that capacity.
Congrats.
Yeah. Right. But like maybe you start training, maybe you do like exercise. At first, those nociceptors are going to be a little sensitive. You know, if you've never trained before and you go to the gym and it's like you're hot and you're uncomfortable and you're like, I hate this, right? I promise it gets better over time. You know, like, because your receptors go, okay, I guess we can survive lifting dumbbells, you know? So the pain part of it starts to disappear, which is also why working out and physically training makes you a little bit less sensitive to the aches and pains associated with physical activity. And so that's nociceptors. Those are the pain receptors. We got photoreceptors. Those are kind of cool. Those are the ones in your eyeballs. They sense different wavelengths of light, you know? So if you've ever had that conversation with someone, I feel like it's a conversation like somebody has at like a bar, you know, and they're like, how do I know my blue is the same as your blue? You know, and it's like, first off, it's not exactly the same, but we do know because we can measure the length of these photoreceptors. We can actually see them. All of our blues, for the most part, are the same, unless anybody in the call right now is colorblind. If you are colorblind, well, then you might be missing 1 or 2 specific photoreceptors. Those are the ones that sense like light changes. We've got chemoreceptors. There's a lot of different versions of those. Chemoreceptors sense chemical changes. So how do we know the difference between something that's very salty versus something that's very sweet? Well, they're different chemicals, so they taste different ways, you know? We all know a little bit about like, you know, what copper tastes like. If you've ever, had like a really dark, you ever get like a really dark chocolate? The reason dark chocolate's a little bit more bitter is because it has more minerals in it. It's got like a lot of copper in it in particular. And that's why it tastes a little more bitter, which some people love. I love dark chocolate. But we also know that like copper and iron, they're both metals, but they do kind of have a different taste, or like a different smell in particular as well, right? If you've ever been around like somebody cutting metal before, different metals, they smell a little bit, and they're just different things. So our chemoreceptors can sense like different changes. Salty versus sweet is a good example of that. Well, there's actually a lot of chemoreceptors in your body. You ever get nauseous from working out a little bit too hard? That is actually the lactic acid from exercise leaking into your digestive system. And your digestive system thinks that you just basically drank battery acid. And so it's going, all right, well, we probably got to get that out of the body. Why am I talking about vomiting so much today? I promise this is not normal. For those of you who are new. But that's a chemoreceptor situation, right? Your body is sensing chemical changes. Now, the one that we're going to spend most of our time talking, so there's a lot of receptors out there. The one that we spend most of our time talking about are going to be what are called mechanoreceptors. So mechanoreceptors are receptors that sense changes in like mechanical distortions, physical distortions, right? So they're sensing things like stretch or tension or acceleration, like if something's speeding up, right? Those are what mechanoreceptors are going to respond to. Now, again, I want to remind you guys that the sensory receptors, all of them, are part of your nervous system, even if they don't live directly in your brain or directly in your nervous system, right? So like your taste buds are part of your nervous system, even though they are living in your tongue. These mechanoreceptors are part of your nervous system, even though they're living in places like your muscles or your tendons or your ligaments or just in between two bones in the joint, right? So those are kind of the three main ones that we're going to talk about. I would say if you forget everything that I talk about today, but only remember one concept, I would say that this is probably the big part that I want you to remember. So mechanoreceptors that we're going to spend most of our time talking, there's other ones out there, but the ones that we're going to talk about are muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and a general category, we're just going to say joint receptors. There's actually, oh, good Lord. There's actually a lot of them. Sorry, hold on, let this focus. Focus. Whatever. Hey, whoop, there we go. I need a manual freaking focus button. So let's go ahead and look up some pictures of this. Let's look at muscle spindles. So muscle spindles, they live in the belly of the muscle, okay? So they're basically gonna run end to end in a muscle fiber, okay? And their job is to send information to the brain saying, hey, this muscle is currently at this length. So earlier when we were talking about proprioception, right? How do I know my arm is bent halfway? Well, a muscle spindle is gonna send information to my brain saying the bicep is currently at half of its maximum length. It can go about this much further, it can go about this much shorter, right? That's what muscle spindles do, okay? So they are sensory receptors located throughout the belly of the muscle, responsible for sensing changes in length and also the rate of length change. You can make a muscle spindle kind of freak out if you change its length too rapidly. If you take a muscle from being like unstretched to being stretched really fast, it'll cause your nervous system to kind of freak out. You can actually experience that right now really quickly. If you guys want to do this, please don't hurt yourself, but just with just your arm outstretched, go like this as fast as you can. You might feel a little tingly afterwards, like kind of everywhere. And that's your nervous system going, ah, and getting turned on really fast. Kind of feels weird, right? Wouldn't have happened if we warmed up. By the way, because you would be easing in and your system would get turned on first, but kind of coming out of nowhere kind of freaks it out a little. So you can see they kind of coil around the muscle, kind of works like this actually. You can see like it's sort of like a spring almost. And so like this version, you can see the spring is sort of relaxed and here it's being stretched out and here it's sort of being tightened in. So that's telling our brain how long the muscle is. The other one that we've got is what's called a Golgi tendon organ. And your tendons are really interesting because like they are separate from the muscle, but they're always connected to the muscle, right? So here you can actually see kind of a weird black and white drawing, but this is the muscle here. And what happens is like eventually the muscle cells kind of end, and what you're going to see is you're going to start to end up with like all of this like collagen proteins and all this really kind of stiff, sticky stuff. A really good analogy for it is it's kind of like hot glue. If you've ever used like a hot glue gun, you know, if you were to like have like a bundle of sticks, right, and you just kind of bundle them all up and you hot glue gun the very end of it, that glue would kind of seep in and would get through all the like little tiny, you know, little gaps in the stick, and it would kind of glue them all together. That's kind of how your tendons work. And then they're long and they kind of go to the very end, and eventually they will insert onto a bone, which your bones have a lot of holes in them. So again, if hot glue sort of threaded itself through all those little pores in the bones, right, it would get a really good grip. So there's a sensory receptor running throughout that tendon, and you can actually, here's a good picture. That sensory, oh, that's an even better one. That sensory receptor is known as a Golgi tendon organ. And its job is to sense the tension in a muscle. So like if that hot, you know, if that tendon fiber, if those tendon fibers are going to lose their grip on the muscle fibers, or if those tendon fibers are going to lose their grip on the bone fibers, right, then it's going to tear off. So your nervous system wants to know about that because obviously we don't want to detach our tendons from the bones, right? So there's a sensory receptor located in the tendon that's responsible for sensing the tension and the rate of tension changes. So think of tension as like how much grip there is, right? If the tension's really high, you know, it's like that scene with Captain America holding on to the helicopter, and he's like, you know, like he's like trying not to lose his grip, right? If he were a Golgi tendon organ, the information going to the brain would be, I'm losing my grip, right? That's what a Golgi tendon organ does. It senses how much tension, how much of a grip it still has on the bone. If that gets really, really high, the tendon thinks it's going to rip off the bone, which obviously we don't want to do. And then lastly, we have joint receptors, just as a sort of general category, because there's actually a lot of different ones. But there's like Ruthenian corpuscles, which is hard to say, Pacinian corpuscles. There's a lot of different Ruffini endings. There's a lot of different types of receptors. We're just going to say joint receptors in general. And their job is to live in the capsule of a joint. You can see this is your, actually, I don't know what this is, probably your knee joint. But you can see, right, this like in this capsule here, there's all these different receptors, including more like Golgi tendons, by the way. And their job is to sense pressure changes. So when two bones start to get close together and the joint capsule is experiencing, it's kind of like a balloon being overinflated, there's going to be more pressure, right? Joint receptors are going to sense that. They're also in charge of sensing whether something is accelerating or if it's decelerating. So if the joint is moving in one direction or the other, acceleration versus deceleration, that information is going to come into your brain. So let's say, again, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to bend my arm back and forth like this. How do I know it's actually happening? How do I have that proprioception of where my arm is at whatever given time? Well, the muscle spindle is saying, hey, the bicep is currently at this length. Now it's at this length. Now it's at this length. Now it's at this length, right? And the Golgi tendon organ is saying, hey, now that it's fully relaxed, there's like no tension here, right? Because it's just, you know, in kind of a relaxed, shortened state. Here, if I'm trying to like hyperextend my arm, there's a lot of tension, right? I might tear my bicep tendon even, right? That's actually one of the reasons why I personally don't recommend a mixed grip deadlift. For the record, it works really well. Mixed grip deadlift makes deadlifting so much easier, but I don't like it personally because the upside down hand gets into an overstretched position and it can tear the bicep tendon. And I hate that idea. So like, you know, because again, it's Captain America. You know, like not good. Or it's Tobey Maguire in the second Spider-Man, where he's like just overstretched, right? So that information is going into my brain. Muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors are how my brain understands where it is in space, how it understands its relative position. But that information is not always good. Sometimes your muscle spindles, for instance, are filthy liars. Those freaking muscle spindles love to say, hey, we're at max length right now. We can't possibly stretch any further, which is totally not true if there is scar tissue in the muscle. So how do we get the muscle spindle to relax? Well, for those of you who have already been through one of our program design classes, you'll know we use what's called autogenic inhibition. I put pressure on the Golgi tendon organ, which actually makes the Golgi tendon organ freak out, right? I put pressure on it through like foam rolling or massage or just stretch, right? And all of a sudden that tendon's like, I'm being overstretched. I'm going to tear. So then it says, I'm going to tear, I'm going to tear, I'm going to tear. What's the safest thing to do? Relax the muscle. Because if the muscle relaxes, it'll have more length and it's less likely to continue tearing because it's working against it. So if it relaxes, it won't tear. So that's actually one of the ways that one of the reasons why we hold a big long stretch for like 30 seconds. We're putting pressure on the tendon, which causes it to get really sensitive. It's like, But if we hold it for about 30 seconds, it will actually tell the muscle to relax. It'll say, hey, muscle, shut up for a second. And it'll let go. And all of a sudden, we get increased range of motion. That's why we hold our stretches for a full 30 seconds. We'll talk about that in later classes. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of changes to our clients when we are training them, because mostly what we are training is their nervous system. We're training their nervous system how to get better at particular movements and how to adapt to exercise. Questions, comments, concerns. That is the nervous system in a nutshell. Any questions so far?
Nope.
Good.
Love that. Feeling good. All right. Cool. Well, let's look at the skeletal system. Skeletal system, a little bit easier to understand. Not quite as much anatomy that we're going to see here, but so your skeletal system is going to be made up of a whole bunch of bones. Each bone, like I said, technically considered its own organ. And then all those little individual organs come together to make up this big system. Now, a lot of times we think of our bones as being very separated, but they are connected with connective tissue. So when I say the skeletal system, I actually don't just mean your bones. I mean, it is your bones, it is your joints, so the space where those two bones are coming together, and all of your joint connective tissue, ligaments, cartilage, bursa, all those types of little special materials that happen to live between our bones. So we are going to see that it is our framework. It also gives our muscular system something to manipulate, gives our muscular system something to move around. Without our skeletal system, we would just be, this squishy sack laying on the ground, we'd be a jellyfish, which is great if we're underwater. But I mean, I don't relish the idea of being wet all day. So we're going to divide our skeletal system into two primary divisions. We are going to have our axial skeleton, and we are going to have our appendicular skeleton. So the axial skeleton is actually protecting your central nervous system. So this is going to be, man, can I get a freaking unpixelated picture here, please? Internet. There we go. Your axial skeleton is going to be your skull, that's protecting your brain, and your vertebrae, which is protecting your central nervous system. It is also going to protect the delicate structures of like most of your main central organs, your heart and lungs, digestive system there. So your axial skeleton is your skull, your vertebrae, and your rib cage. And then your appendicular skeleton, that's your appendages, right? So that is your collarbone attaching your entire arm, as well as your scapula, and then your pelvic bones attaching your entire legs. So it is your arms and legs. The shoulder girdle, which is that collarbone and scapula, and pelvic girdle, which is the pelvis there. So that's the two primary divisions there. Now, like I said, when we're talking about our skeletal system, obviously we are talking about bones, right? Bones are these big long levers that your muscular system gets to manipulate. Now, make no mistake, a lot of people think like your bones are kind of this like, you know, we give them credit for being calcium, right? It's like your bones are made of calcium. We need, you know, we all remember the Got Milk ads from the 90s, right? Actually, I say that, but good Lord. Maybe they're, maybe not at this point. He said, having an existential crisis. But, you know, we all think of like, we think of bones, we think of calcium, right? And that is what we see left over. You know, if, you know, you're walking through the desert and you run upon a skeleton, yeah, you're going to see all the calcium kind of left over in the end. But your bones are very much alive, just like your muscles are. They need to have blood flow and nutrients delivered to them. They are a living tissue. And so your bones are constantly remodeling, right? You guys probably, you know, I know those of you who have been with me for a while, you definitely understand this. But, you know, even if you're brand new today, you probably know that like, well, when you go to the gym, you exercise, which tells your body, it's like, hey, I need more muscle mass because I got to deal with this exercise stuff, you know? Well, the same thing is true of your bones. When you go to the gym and you work out, or when you're physically active, you are actually going to create microscopic damage in your skeletal system. You're going to create all these little tiny microscopic fractures. And then your immune system is going to come along and be like, what did you do? Yeah, you broke all my bone, you know? So then what it'll do is it'll actually repair that skeletal tissue. And this is something we don't fully understand yet. But what's really fun is your immune system never repairs things back to the way they were. It always makes them just a little bit stronger and a little bit more resistant to damage for the future. So if you create that skeletal damage, your immune system goes, all right, well, I'm going to make this bone a little bit more resistant to damage so that you can't break it down again. And guess what? Well, then we run a little faster next time, or we do a couple extra push-ups, or we lift a little bit heavier weight. And then we create more microscopic damage, and the process has to just kind of keep repeating. And that's why exercise increases our bone density. And it's primarily because of these two main types of cells, your osteoclasts and your osteoblasts. Now, your osteoclasts are actually your bone breaker downers. Their job is actually to resorb any damaged or imperfect bone tissue. And that might sound like a bad thing, you know, because you're like, oh, that's what's decreasing my bone density, right? But it's like remodeling your kitchen. You got to tear out the old cabinets if you're going to put the new ones in. So we actually really like our osteoclasts, and we actually want to trigger osteoclast activity by being physically active and creating those microscopic fractures. We actually want that to happen because then our osteoblasts, which are our bone makers, can come along afterwards and increase that bone density. So if we look at like osteoclasts versus osteoblasts, it's this constant remodeling process, right? Osteoclasts are going to find an imperfection, and they're going to come along and they're going to eat away that imperfection. And then what they do actually, they're actually programmed to self-destruct. Once they're done fixing, eating away any imperfections, they use, it's called apoptosis, which is, you can literally think of it as the cell pops. They go, and what that does is that releases all the calcium that they ate into the area. And then the osteoblast comes along and it spits out this like glue-like structure, glue-like substance. And then that attracts all the calcium back down, along with any that you've eaten recently. And that's what makes the bones a little bit denser. So we can trigger that through physical activity, which is great, right? So yeah, when you go to the gym, yes, you are building. There we go. We can see there's an imperfection there. So that imperfection is going to get all eaten away. And then this is going to come along afterwards and fix it. But you can think of it as like, yes, you are there to build muscle, but you are also there to build bone. And honestly, you're also there to build neurons as well. So when we're kids, our osteoblasts, our bone makers, are really, really active. And then as we get older, unfortunately, our osteoclasts actually become more active, which is one of the reasons why seniors struggle with bone density issues so often. And one of the reasons why it's so important to become, to stay physically active as seniors. So those are, kind of how our bones are going to kind of grow and stuff. Now, there are going to be some major categories of bones. Just so you guys get a little bit familiar with the shape of our bones. We got a couple different types out there. This is an example of what we call by the way, this is not going to be poetry. But we've got long bones, which guess what? They're long. They're longer than they are anything else. They tend to be like, long stretched out bones, right? Here's your femur. This is the longest bone in your body. It's your thigh bone, right? And so that's one major category. We've also got short bones, which they are not long. These are sometimes called cube bones. And they tend to be like similar in length and width. So they tend to be kind of square shaped. So long bones are long, short bones are short. We've also got flat bones, which tend to be kind of thin, flat bones that are very protective of certain tissues. Your scapula is a good example of that. Your pelvis is a good example of that. And then we have, I love this. It's like scientists ran out of names and they were like, what do we call the rest of them? It's like, the weird bones. These are the irregular bones. They tend to have a pretty unique shape from one another. All the cube bones were actually pretty similar in shape, but these irregular bones, each of your vertebrae, they're somewhat similar, but they're all pretty unique from one another even though they are all vertebrae as a group. And so they'll each have kind of a unique shape and a unique function there. Now, on each of these bones, you're also going to see some very interesting markings sometimes, different dents, different little flattened, indented portions, or you'll see what are called processes, right? And processes are little projections from your bones. So for instance, if we look at like what's called the greater trochanter of your femur, right? That's a process, right? It's this big projection here, obviously you've got the head here that inserts into the femur or into the pelvis, right? But look at this big projection right here. That's the greater trochanter. And there's a bunch of muscles that attach to it. All of your glute muscles, for instance, come in and attach that to allow, to kind of, I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. If you got that greater trochanter, right? Well, this is going to basically pull this way. And that's going to cause the muscle, the bone rather, to swing out like that. We call that abduction, right? So that's a process projecting from a bone. You'll also see indented, right? If we look at our scapula, for instance. You can see, oh my God, can I get one unpixelated picture, please? One big picture. So you can see like this big indentation, right? It's like a valley, right? And a muscle called your supraspinatus lives up there. And it lives in that little valley. So lots of like fun, interesting shapes on your bones. Really, the only thing you guys need to be concerned with are the major categories. You've got projections, those are called processes, and you've got indentations, those are called depressions. Yeah, what's up, Marjan? Question. What you got?
Okay, you said the 3 bones is flat bones, long bones, and what was the other one?
Oh, long, short, flat, and irregular.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Those are sort of our major categories.
And short bone was which one? The one
like the wrist here.
Yeah.
Short, think like cuboid bones, right there. That's sometimes what they're often called. I mean, your cuboid is actually the name of a bone in your foot. But like sometimes they're called like cube bones or cuboid bones because they are similar in length and width, and though they're called short bones because it's like, I mean, imagine. Let me take a long bone here.
Like femur is a long one.
Yeah, even your fingers, right? Even like Oh, actually, here's a list of all the long bones. That's kind of nice. So longer than it is anything else, longer than it is. Even your fingers, though, your phalanges is what those are called. These are still considered long bones. I mean, obviously, you know, this little, very just tip of the finger from here to here is obviously not as long as my femur, but the shape of it, it is longer than it is wide, right? Whereas like these bones are kind of like the same in length and width. So they're kind of like a square.
That's
So
how you
that's the
get
difference.
short.
Yeah. They don't
Okay.
need to be 12 inches long to be considered a long bone. That's not what makes them a long bone. They just need to be longer than they are anything else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
And can you show me the other picture that before this? That all
This
that,
one?
yeah. Just
Yeah.
want to take a picture.
So yeah, your collarbone, that's longer
Uh-huh.
than it is anything else, right?
Okay.
Let's see if I can find a picture of all that. It's kind of cool. I've actually never Googled that picture before. Flat bones. Oh my God, this website's great. Oh my God, it's Wikipedia. Oh, of course it is. That's hilarious. So here's all the flat ones, right? Even like your sternum is a really good example, right? They tend to be very flat and very protective. I guess that's not all of them because usually your patella, your kneecap, is considered a flat bone. I know it's kind of round, but it's flat and it kind of protects the structures of the two bones coming together. So those are flat bones. Irregular bones.
Yep.
You can get a picture of that. So it should be all the vertebrae. Yeah, and all the weird skull ones. Uh-oh. There it is. So your face bones, you know. Oh, that's funny. I guess the sacrum is considered one. I've always considered the sacrum to be a flat bone. But yeah, those are kind of like what the major categories are.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So processes are projections. You can see like your spinal processes, for instance. Look at how many projections are on your spine, which makes a lot of sense considering you've got all of these little itty bitty tiny muscles attaching each of your vertebrae together, right? All those little tiny itsy bitsy muscles. Like, look at those things. We need to have a lot of projections there, you know, a lot of attachment sites. I'm always picturing in my head whenever I'm talking about like processes and depressions. Whenever I'm talking about, I'm always thinking of like a rock climbing wall. You know, like sometimes you get your hand in the little hole, right? That's like a depression, right? And then sometimes you're just grabbing the outside portion. That's like a process. And then your muscles do the same thing. So those are the bones, right? That's an overview of the bones. Now we've also got joints. If we're talking about our skeletal system, you know, this is the sometimes your joints, they call those an articulation. That's the more scientific fancy term. But a joint is where two bones are meeting, right? So if I take, you know, let's say these are two like solid pieces and I put them together, right? I can sort of manipulate in those directions there, right? I can kind of spin like that. So there's going to be three main types of movements in joints. Sometimes we're going to see a rolling action, which kind of looks like this. You can see I'm sort of rolling from one surface to another. So like if this was a perfect circle, right, I would sort of roll. You can also see a gliding action. So if I slide like that, right? And then sometimes we'll see a spinning action. So if I sort of cupped around it like this and I spun around the axis, right? So those are the three main like types of movements. Rolling, let's see if I can find. I have learned to not simply Google rolling joint action on Google Images because that never pulls up what I'm looking for. So you can kind of see the rolling action here. Let's see if I can find a GIF of this actually. There we go. So there's the sort of rolling action that we see, right? Think about your knee or your elbow, right? That's a good example of the roll. And then we'll also see the gliding action. Oh, actually, nope, hold on. There we go. There's the gliding action. You can kind of see that, right, as it sort of slides. A lot of your joints will do, it's not like any of your joints are just doing one of these things, by the way. It's just that these are the three things, like your knee, for instance, rolls and slides. So when you're like extending your knee and flexing your knee, it actually starts with a little bit of a roll and then does a little gliding action as it continues that roll. So it kind of does a combo of the two. But those are the two big ones. And then we'll see a spinning action as well, which I can never find a good picture of the spin one. Spinning. Come on, internet. I mean, I don't know why I'm expecting, poor internet has to like draw these things because I can't. But basically spinning is, about its axis. You guys know what a spin is. But yeah, those are sort of the three main joint actions that we see. So those are sort of the three ways that all of our joints move. Now, there is two major categories of joints. Really, there's three, but there's two like major categories, right? There's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about, which is probably what you're thinking of, which is what's called a synovial joint. Okay, a synovial joint is a joint that has a capsule. There's like a lot of space between the joint. If we look at the difference between like synovial and non-synovial, a synovial joint has like a capsule in it, like space between the two bones. Okay. Actually, here's a really good example. So this over here on the right, this is a synovial joint. Look at how there's this little cavity here with like some soft tissue that basically keeps the cavity filled with this fluid called synovial fluid, right? And that synovial fluid exists in that type of joint because there's a lot of movement in that type of joint. Synovial joints are what you're thinking of. They're 80% of the joints in your body, and synovial means fully movable joint. Okay, so a synovial joint, there are articulations. Over here. There are articulations that have a joint cavity, and then they have specialized structures that allow for greater movement, right? So you'll see synovial fluid in there. Synovial fluid is this like egg white looking material. It's basically like grease or oil in your car. It keeps there from being, too much friction, right? And so, if your bones are moving all day, right? Imagine if you just did this all day, my hands are going to be pretty freaking hot by the end of the day, right? And so that's there to sort of like decrease that friction. It's like a lubricant. We'll also see some cartilage oftentimes. You can see that here in this picture. We go over here, see how there's cartilage, right? That's also going to decrease friction if those bones happen to touch each other at some point. We'll also see things like fat pads, bursa. So fat pads. Yeah, there are a lot of them in your face, but that's not the one I'm concerned with. So fat pads are like in your knee, for instance. They're there to just kind of decrease the friction. You can feel that underneath your kneecap, actually. And then like they're there to decrease friction when muscles grind and things like that. You'll also find like bursa, which are these little like fluid-filled sacs. They're also there to decrease friction. So it makes sense that we have all these materials in the fully movable joints that basically decrease our friction, and they make it easy for us to move. But sometimes we get in trouble, sometimes the cartilage gets worn down. That's what arthritis is, if you live a hard life, manual labor and you're grinding your knees and stuff, that can sometimes wear down the cartilage. And so then there's a little bit too much friction in the joint. Or maybe you'll end up with what's called bursitis, where the bursa actually, because of maybe an altered range of motion, you can actually tear the lining of those fluid-filled sacs. And then that fluid can leak into the area, and now it's not a big squishy sac anymore. It's kind of a deflated sac. And so now muscles start rubbing on the bone, or bone starts rubbing on bone, right? And that's what bursitis is. It's very similar to tendonitis. Tendonitis is like a muscular problem. Bursitis is like a skeletal problem. So there's other materials in there, and that's what we think of when we think of our joints. So we want to make sure we are moving our joints the right way. And that's why we're talking about this right now, right? We're in the assessments class. I'm going to teach you guys how to look at somebody and see if they're moving the wrong way. What's the wrong? What do you mean the wrong way? What if that's just how I move, right? And it's like, yes, but you're moving that way because certain muscles are maybe recruiting and moving the bones and manipulating the wrong way. And that creates alterations in the kinetic chain. So we're going to definitely be looking at that. Also within your synovial joints, you are going to see a big connective tissue known as a ligament. And ligaments are structures that connect your bones to other bones, okay? So like your femur being connected to your fibula here, or, that's a ligament. So ligaments connect bones to other bones. Your ACL, that's your anterior cruciate ligament. Again, that kind of crosses at an angle like this. You get your PCL, which crosses like that, right? And so they both make this X, and it attaches your femur to your tibia. And so like this, and then you got this one right here, that's your LCL, that's your lateral collateral ligament. On the other side, you'd have your medial collateral ligament. And so that creates all the structures in the knee. If you look at like knee ligaments, right, you can see all of them just connecting the various sections of those bones, right? So there's the ACL, there's the PCL on the back, the LCL, and the MCL. You don't have to have those memorized right now, by the way. We'll look at those later. But that's what's adding stability to my knee. Because the thing that's really great about synovial joints is that they move a lot. What is not so great about them is that they are not very stable because they move a lot. With increased mobility comes decreased stability. So we do want to make sure that we've got a lot of muscle surrounding the area to add to that stability. Again, one more reason why it's so important for us to train in these wobbly situations. For those of you who are new, we are going to be teaching you guys a lot of unstable, wobbly versions of exercises. And that is really where you should start with everybody, because that's going to build a foundation of strong movement patterns. Now, there are two other types of joints out there that we don't talk about quite as often. One of them is semi-movable joints. Your vertebrae is a good example of that. We obviously need to be able to move our vertebrae, but we don't want to move it too much. So those are semi-movable joints. That's a non-synovial joint. And this one is like a semi-movable version. There's a disc that separates the two vertebrae, and that allows a little bit of spinning action, but not a lot of spinning action, right? It allows a little bit of like rolling side to side, maybe a little bit of a glide, but we don't want too much movement there. We really want to have a lot of stability in our spine, which is why we train for so much stability, planks and things like that. And then we've got fully non-movable joints. And that is like the sutures of your skull. So your skull is made up of it's like, I think, what, 7 different bones. And so like they all come together. They're really not meant to move very much. In fact, they're pretty much fused together for the most part. Your sacrum is a good example of that. It used to be separate little bones. Now they're all kind of fused together, right? So those are non-movable joints. Yeah, they're a joint, because they're 2 bones coming together. But we really don't want to see any movement there. So most of what we're going to talk about, because obviously personal training is all related to human movement, most of what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about how to manipulate and move synovial joints. But we also need to talk about how to have stability in our non-synovial joints. So yes, I will definitely show you how to move your ball and socket joint here through a full range of motion. But we'll also talk about how to create stability in the spine so that it doesn't move too much in any one given direction and cause us to throw out our back. So everything we've talked about today is related to human movement. And we do want to make sure that we are training all aspects of this. We want to train because it creates a strong skeletal system. It allows us to move that skeletal system, but it also allows us to stabilize it. And we're going to teach our nervous system how to do those things properly. And one of the best ways to do it is through what we call weight-bearing exercise. This is exercise that particularly works directly against gravity as a resistance. Now, running, lifting weights, calisthenic body weight exercises, and then obviously, barbells, dumbbells, things like that. Those are all examples of weight-bearing exercise. And weight-bearing exercise has particularly been shown to be the best for strengthening your skeletal system. Now, do I like resistance bands? Do I like swimming? Do I like cycling? Yeah, absolutely. All those things are great. But if I have a client with particularly like skeletal problems, I do want to focus primarily on weight-bearing exercise. Anything that uses gravity as a resistance, we're not 100% sure why, but that has been shown to have the most positive effects on the skeletal system. Now, does that mean that you're going to have bad bone density as a cyclist? No, definitely not. It still builds bone density, but in particular, the gravity-based stuff is a little bit better. So that is pretty much it for day one. Like I said, 3 components, just to summarize everything up, 3 components of the kinetic chain. That's the muscular, skeletal, and nervous systems. We will talk about the muscular system primarily tomorrow. Your nervous system is the communication network. It needs to get information in, interpret that information, and then send a response out. And then that is going to tell your muscular system how to manipulate the skeletal system in the way that it was designed to be manipulated, right? We want to see those rolling actions. We want to see those spinning actions, those gliding actions. And we want them to do it the way that they're supposed to do it, rather than like maybe a muscle that's like grinding, or I'm sorry, a bone that's like grinding on another bone, wearing down the cartilage because we're in a range of motion that we really shouldn't be in, Now, how do you know what those ranges of motion are supposed to be? Well, that's what the glorious science of fitness assessments is really all about. But that's pretty much it today, guys. Any final questions, comments, or concerns? How y'all feeling?
Feeling good.
Love that.
Feeling good.
Cool.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, well,
Good
let me kill the
info, thank
recording
you.
here. What's up?
It wasn't that hard to me, I guess.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's all review. You saw it last mod, right? We kind of
Yeah.
started this stuff.
Yeah.
We really don't like to teach it once and then leave it alone. We like to revisit it, Simon, I think you're officially in your final mod. I want you, hopefully you're feeling and you're like, yeah, I got this. I know what he's gonna say. Like,
Yeah, I got this.
right? That's where we want you. All right, let me kill the recording here.